There's a point at which you get so dusty, no amount of bathing can get rid of it. It gets caked on, gets in your eyes, your ears, your teeth. Little grains hang onto your scalp even after you shampoo 2 or 3 times. That's how dusty I am right now. That's how dusty I got before I finally found Lexi. It didn't go the way I hoped. This is Spines. If this had happened before the digital age, I guess I'd be doing this as a personal ad in the paper. Misconnection. In the candlelit attic surrounded by 8 people I think might have been our friends once upon a time. I was the blood-drenched brunette. You were the cute guy with black fingernails and a coyote skull in one hand. I think we had a moment, but I lost track of you after the fire started and I stabbed the skull man with his own obsidian dagger. Let's meet for coffee, and maybe we can help each other remember our names. But no one reads newspapers anymore. And these messages aren't just for you, mystery guy. They are for you, but they're also for our friends, and anyone who knew me before, and anyone who might recognize the things I'm talking about. It's already paying off. After that first message, I got a lot of email. Like, a lot. And most of it, granted, was crackpot bullshit. Like, hey, you and I were abducted by the same aliens. Or stuff about me being possessed by the devil. Stuff like that. But there were a couple of good, solid leads. I can't talk about some of them, not yet. But here's one I think is important to share. It says, Dear Wren, the Seekers won't stop until they get their trumpet. If you can, kill them all. The Seekers. A couple other emails mentioned them. And I might have written those messages off as more crackpot garbage, except one email just said the words, Seekers of Dodona. When I looked up Dodona, guess what I found? Bingo. A grove. A sacred grove in Greece. The Seekers of Dodona. Sounds like a shitty role-playing game. Still, it might be my first big lead. So, dear listeners, the Seekers of Dodona, what do you got for me? I was working on finding some of the others when I heard about the dust storms moving along the edges of the city. If you live in this town, then you know what I mean. If you don't, you probably haven't heard anything about them. It hasn't been in the paper, or on the TV, or the radio. No one's talking about it online. It's like there's just something about the dust people don't want to think about too much. But they're not just regular dust devils, not just regular windy days carrying a lot of dirt in the air. No, these are big, dark storms, so thick with dust they blot out the sun. Cars have to pull off to the side of the road, and a lot of them crash anyway. People who get caught in them have to go to the hospital because they can't breathe. It's like those pea soup fogs that hit Victorian London, the ones that just suffocated people by the thousands. But worse than anything that happens when the dust storms hit is what happens when they're over. After the storms have blown away, things are just different. People whisper about it. I listen while waiting in line in coffee shops or in aisles at the grocery store. People use hushed tones, like they're afraid to talk about it too loud. No one wants to say too much, but they can't help notice that places hit by the storms are never quite the same. Not in a way people can really pin down. Plants die, and people would be sick and tired, but it's like every place the dust storms happens just feels worse. Older, more run down, more broken. At that point, I didn't know it was Lexi doing it, but I did think it was probably one of my old friends. I don't know why I thought that, but I did. So I went to find myself a dust storm. A memory from before the attic. I'm sick. I'm in bed and sweating and half delirious with fever. I can't get comfortable and I keep sneezing and coughing and my throat hurts. I'm thinking about getting up and making tea or something, but I just don't have the energy. So I lay in bed and feel miserable and try and fail to sleep. At some point, I notice a pain in my chest different from the other flu symptoms I'm having. It's a sharp, jagged pain, climbing slowly up my chest, getting closer to my throat every time I cough. Finally, I spit something up. It's hard and angular, and it nearly cracks my tooth. Shaking, I turn on the light on the bedside table. There, in my hand, is a deep green gem, an emerald. Then I wipe my forehead where I've been sweating with fever, and my fingertips shimmer with tiny particles of diamond. Finding a dust storm is harder than you might think. They don't talk about them on the weather report, and you can't just see the clouds coming like with rain. But by this time, the dust storms were happening every other day or so I figured if I drove around long enough, I was sure to find one. On my third day of searching, I got lucky. I was driving around the edge of town, making my second pass across the city, when I finally saw the heavy, black-brown wall of dust on the horizon. All of the other cars on the road were headed away from it, frantically trying to get home before it caught up with them. I was the only car heading in the other direction. It didn't take long for us to meet, this dust storm and I. I couldn't believe how hard the winds were, how much it made my car swerve around the road. I lost visibility right away, and I slammed on the brakes. Even with the doors shut and the windows rolled up, dust was still getting into my car somehow. I sat there for a minute, doing nothing, because I realized I hadn't really bothered to come up with a plan beyond finding the dust storm. So I just sat there and stared at the dust flying around and tried to see if there was anything weird or different about it. At first, it was just dust. Thick, brown, boring. I couldn't even see 1 foot past my bumper, so I couldn't tell what was going on out on the street. But then I noticed something weird about the dust right in front of my windshield. There was some kind of shape in it, some texture that stood out from the surrounding cloud. It was a little darker from the rest, a kind of blobby shape about 2 feet across. I also thought I caught just a hint of spindly little legs sticking out from the sides, like on a tick. And then, just as the car rocked with a particularly strong gust of wind, 2 yellow lights blinked from the middle of the shape. Eyes. A second after I saw the eyes, the shape darted up and out of sight to the roof of my car. There was a tapping sound, and even though the wind roared all around me, so loud I could barely think straight, I knew that tapping wasn't just the sound of the storm. This tapping had a rhythm to it. It was like it was testing something. I didn't move until the storm passed. Even after the air had mostly cleared, I waited until I saw other people walking outside, other cars on the streets. Then I got out and checked the roof of my car. There, right in the middle of the roof, the blue paint job had been worn away to the metal in a big, messy circle. Like when you see cars that are 30 years old, where the paint is peeling away from sun damage. Except this car didn't even have a scratch on it the day before. Not that I really give a shit about how my car looks, but it does make me wonder what kind of thing can do years of damage in a few minutes. The first expedition into the dust storms was obviously a failure, so I decided to make a second attempt. This time, when I found a storm, I didn't stay in one spot. As much as it scared me, and as much as it seemed like a dumb idea, I kept crawling along at about 2 miles per hour. I kept my headlights on and a flashlight beam pointed out the window, but it didn't make much of a difference. I almost bumped into parked cars a couple of times, but I managed to drive through the storm for a while without any big crashes or disasters. I saw those weird blobby shapes with the yellow eyes 3 times. One of them settled on the hood of my car, which now has another spot where the paint is worn through. Another just darted around outside the window like it was looking for a place to get in. The third was attached to a stop sign, which I could barely see through the storm. I went back later and found that the stop sign was now so faded you could barely tell what it used to be. I saw something else, though, aside from those shapes. I was on a wide 4-lane road, one I'd picked because I thought it would be easier to avoid hitting something. I knew there was a concrete median in the center of the road because I kept bumping into it. I was inching along, trying to spot one of those shapes, when I saw something bigger out ahead of me, where only the median should have been. At first, I thought it was just another one of those creatures with its 2 glowing yellow eyes. But then I realized that this shape was actually a lot bigger and a lot farther away. It came into focus as I got closer. A house. A cottage, to be exact. A little cottage with lights burning in the 2 front windows like little eyes. I stopped the car and watched. There was no way a cottage should be where this one was, but it was definitely there, right on the median. It was only about 10 feet away, but between my car and the front door was roaring wind and dust blowing so fast it could sand your skin right off. I tried to do the thing I did before. You know, when I somehow got into Carson's studio without opening the door or breaking a window. I imagined myself just closing my eyes in the car and opening them in the cottage. Then I imagined flying through the air and through the front wall like a ghost. Neither worked. I guess it's something I can only do when I'm not thinking about it, which, in my mind, makes it pretty fucking useless. Finally, the dust storm started to clear. I turned to look through the back window, and when I turned back, the cottage was gone. The dust gradually thinned, and soon the air was clear again. There was nothing there that shouldn't have been there, just a bare, concrete median. Okay, so 0 for 2. I decided to give it one more try. This time, though, I got myself some goggles and a mask. I looked pretty stupid in all that gear, but it sure beat getting sand in my eyes. Just like the other times, I drove around for a couple of days until I found a storm. Just like the other times, I spotted those vague shapes attaching themselves to cars and signs and buildings. And, just like the last time, I found the cottage. It wasn't in the same spot, though. I found it at the end of a cul-de-sac, where an empty lot should have been. Other than that, though, it was the same as last time. A tiny, ramshackle wooden house with light flickering in the windows. I got my mask and goggles on, and before I could think better of it, I went out into the storm. Even bracing myself, I wasn't prepared for how hard those winds hit. I thought they were going to blow me right off my feet, but I managed to stay upright. It wasn't very far to the front door of the cottage, but it took me a long time to get there. By the time I reached for the doorknob, the parts of my skin exposed to the air felt raw, like they'd been sandblasted. I didn't bother knocking. I just went in. The moment I shut the door behind me, the noise stopped. I mean, all of it, like it was completely still outside. I took my goggles off and looked around. A fire burned in the fireplace, and there were lanterns in the windowsills. The ceilings were low, with exposed wood beams. The floor was made up of rough wooden boards, not the fancy polished hardwood people pay extra for. But of course, the thing that really caught my attention was Lexi. She sat at the small kitchen table, her palms pressed to the surface. Sweat poured down her face. Her hair was so damp it was flattened against her scalp, even though it wasn't really that warm in the cottage. She panted and groaned like she was in pain. I said her name, and she looked up. "Not you," she said, tears pouring from her eyes. I found out from Carson how bad it feels to realize someone hates you. I found out from Lexi that finding out someone fears you is much, much worse. I didn't want to scare her any more than I already had, so I stayed by the door. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said. She didn't say anything. She just bent over and groaned again like she had a bad stomach cramp. "What's wrong?" I asked. "What can I do to help?" "Nothing," she snapped. "I'm fine. I've done this enough times before." I let her pant and writhe around for a while before I spoke again. "I thought maybe you were trapped out here in the storms." "Trapped?" she said. "Of course I'm not trapped. This is where I need to be. This is where my babies need to be." I looked around, but I didn't see any babies, and the cottage only had one room. "Lexi," I said at last, "can you tell me anything about how we got to the attic, or how we knew each other before?" "Before?" she asked. "That doesn't make sense. Before is an illusion. There's only now. It's always already now." Okay then, I thought. I tried again, asking her about the attic, but she didn't want to talk about it. "Can't you see I'm busy?" she said, and then she let out a howl and pressed her hands to her stomach. "It's coming," she said. Then Lexi opened her mouth wide. She made some gagging sounds, and I thought she was going to be sick, but nothing came up. As I watched, her neck expanded. It got wider. Far too wide, wider than her head. She twitched her jaw, and it unhinged, falling open. At this point, her open mouth was bigger than most people's faces, a giant, gaping black hole. After a few seconds, something crawled out, a blobby, non-specific shape, translucent, like a jellyfish. And, of course, two of those winking yellow eyes. It pulled itself out of Lexi's mouth and flopped onto the kitchen table, laying there for a moment like it was catching its breath. Lexi sat back, her neck shrinking back down to regular size, her jaw snapping back into place. She stared down at the little shape with a happy, tired smile. "My newest baby," she said. At that moment, it jumped into the air. It didn't have any wings or anything, and I'm not sure how it stayed off the ground. But it glided straight toward me, fixing itself to my arm. I screamed and started to shake it off. It felt moist, unpleasant, but not solid. More like a puff of air from a humidifier. "Don't worry," Lexi said. "It needs to feed off time, and you don't have any." Sure enough, it let go and floated away, like it wasn't interested. It flew over to one of the windows and passed through the glass like it was air. Once I calmed down, I asked Lexi, "What do you mean I don't have time?" She ignored the question. "The forward progression of time is an illusion," she said. "Look." She took off the watch on her wrist and smashed it against the table, little gears and bits of glass flying everywhere. Then she stared down at the wrecked watch, frowning in concentration. Slowly, the pieces moved back together and the watch reassembled itself. "There," she said, once it started ticking again, like I should have understood the point she was trying to make. I asked her how she did that. She looked up at me. "When did you get here? And when did my baby leave?" I begged her to tell me something, anything. I asked her if she knew anything about me or my life before 2 months ago. I could tell she was annoyed. "I told you your questions don't make sense," she said. Then she sighed. "Fine, I'll tell you this, but it's not my fault if you don't understand." Then she said, "A mosaic has 2 ages. Its time began at the moment it was assembled, but it also began whenever each of its tiles did. If you're wondering what that means, so am I. I've got no idea." I asked her more questions, but she either wouldn't answer, or she just babbled something else incomprehensible about time. Finally, I gave up. I told her I'd leave and stop bothering her as soon as the storm passed. "What do you mean?" she said. "The dust storm never passes. It always is. My babies need it to hide in." "No," I said. "The storms only happen every few days." Lexi shook her head. "No. The city meets the storm every few days, but the storm is always." She wouldn't say anything else. So I put on my goggles and my mask and I went back out into the roaring dark. My car was gone, so I walked and walked until my skin was rubbed raw by the sand in the air, and I finally got through the storms and back into the city. 2 days had passed since I opened the front door of the cottage. And, of course, while I was gone, my car got towed. And so, to anyone who's listening, if you see the dust storms coming, take shelter. Because that storm is forever and always, and it hides creatures within it, and at the center is their mother, who would do anything for them. Spines is a production of Zoom Doom Stories. It's narrated by Ren Jones, written by Jamie Killen, website and logos by Benjamin Pond, produced by Jamie Killen and Benjamin Pond. You can support Spines by visiting patreon.com/Spines Podcast and by subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes.